In the opening traversal, the only dangerous section is when you enter the big open room with the subjugator. In order to make the route much more safer, you can walk on the left side behind the columns. These will offer you protection and allow you to easily walk by onto the first encounter of the dungeon, which is quite a boring encounter, but with the optimal lens route that you'll see on the map right now, you can speed up the encounter quite nicely. To start off this encounter nice and simple, the first 2 rounds you shouldn't be panicking because it is very easy to set up both lenses without having to make any errors. However, when you enter the 3rd round, that's when an ideal setup of the lenses is extremely recommended to not having to fix anything, especially when you get to the 3rd truth. So here I'm going to recommend the ideal setup based on the first truth that you get. This will mean that if you set it up this way based on the first room you get, you shouldn't encounter any errors all the way through the 2nd and 3rd truth. If the first truth is in the L2 room, you're going to start from the middle lens pointing up into left with the final pointing into the right. If it's in the L1, you're going to start from the middle lens pointing into down left, into left, and left again into the wall. If the truth is in the R2 room first, you're going to start from the right lens pointing into the right, then into the left wall, and then into the final lens in front of the sign. If the truth is in the R1 room first, you're going to start from the right lens pointing down right into right corner, which leads through the hall and into the final lens, which points into the sign. If you set it up like this, no matter what order you're going to get next in terms of the rooms, you won't need to reassemble any of the other lenses. In terms of dealing with the subjugators efficiently, I was running Arc Titan, which I highly recommend this season, with your Skullfort exotic for ad clearing and good healing, and also Lord of Wolves does a fantastic job at killing the subjugators fast. In order to survive easier, I'd recommend using a Strand, Stasis, and Solar resistances due to the subjugators hitting quite hard and the blade enemies also dealing solar damage with their death projectiles. Onto the 2nd traversal, the tips here would be to not eagerage near the Grims in the big open room, as this can result in silly deaths, and there are 2 danger areas you should watch out for. First is when you're falling into the pit, you should jump to slow down, to not fall down all the way, and the second is within the ball hallway. Do not eagerage here, move on one by one and you'll be fine. And when opening the door, make sure to observe the ogre spawn area to not get flanked by his laser. On to the 2nd encounter, the lock set. And this encounter, in my opinion, is by far the hardest in this dungeon. This honestly should be the final encounter in this dungeon, but it's not. This is because the added density in this encounter is extremely high, meaning if you don't manage them quite well with good healing and damage reduction, you're going to struggle. I have tried this on a Titan and Warlock. I've done much better on Titan, but Warlocks have really good healing options of Devour and crowd control over the entire arena of the turrets. In order to survive better, I'd recommend using a Void Arc and Solar resistances to cover everything in a room. And in order to set up damage, there are 2 strategies based on your preference. Either all stop followed by a kill on the last clock, or always use kill on the last clock to get the full duration of the damage phase extremely quickly, but with the downside of having a lot of enemies during damage. In general, all stop symbols followed by a kill is much more safer if you can efficiently manage the clocks. This means you won't have much enemies to deal with, damage is going to be extremely safe. However, I couldn't manage this quite well and therefore I brute forced it with a Titan. I personally went with brute force kill method immediately, because if you maneuver quite well among the enemies and just stick to ideally one side of the arena, majority of the ads shouldn't bother you. But I still recommend trying the stop method first. In order to survive during the brute force method, I used Skull Fort on my Titan to ensure I get the damage reduction during killing, so I can get healing and charge my super nicely for every damage phase. For damage, I used a Arc Titan with Bulk Charge, not because of the season's bonuses, but because it provides a reliable damage source from range that works very well. I decided to use Weather Horde because it allowed me to have a good amount of ammo for every damage phase without farming much for heavy, because the time frame is quite tight. When damage started, I changed into Cuirass for extra damage from my Thunder Crash, and then I just procced all the Weather Horde shots and standing behind the barricade to get increased reload speed and proccing Bolt Charge. Now, this isn't everything. I highly recommend also putting on a LMG and killing all the wizards and ogre depending on which side you do damage. I did damage from the middle right side, and this made it so that I only see the ogre on my right side from that perspective, or the left side from the spawn point. This is the only ogre I dealt with and the only side I was managing during setup and during damage. By killing this ogre, you will no longer be endlessly beamed by him to death, allowing for easier Weather Horde activations. You should also be killing wizards with this LMG to drop the buffs so that you can quickly start setting up the kill on the final clock, and also to survive easier because the wizards also beam you to death with arc damage. After damage, you should just pick up how many buffs you need, immediately dunk the kill, perform special finishers on the way to replenish your ammo, and go back. But the Horde makes this really efficient, and therefore you should always have a good amount of damage per setup. For Warlock, you could just use Stag with a Healing Rift and camp in the same spot with Weather Horde. You can also use Devourer to get some easy healing during the setup. You can also use your Ice Turret in order to control the battlefield, but ideally the setup would be the same. Instead of hiding behind a barricade, you're going to be sitting in your Healing Rift. Within the third traversal in the dungeon, there is nothing dangerous to be worried about other than don't stand in the light when doing the lenses, and remember that the entrance symbol goes to the left and the worm symbol goes to the right. On to the final encounter, which is much more easier than the log set due to being able to hide within the rooms or within the staircase section in the middle, and with a much more lower ad density. In order to set up damage safer and reducing the risk of dying by the boss, when you get the first truth, I highly recommend going into the middle and writing down within your chat what to turn on and off. This way you won't have to constantly go in and out, and the encounters with the boss chasing you are much more lower. This also means that you should never stand next to the boss because he will always suspend you, creating an easy death situation. In order to speed up the symbols, if the truth symbol has dropped within the room that is in that room, you can check whether it's on, and therefore you can always turn it off if that's the case. However, if you know the lore very well, then you don't even need to look for the Grim. Of course, I've done this on Arc Titan. I used Synthoceps with 1-2 punch in order to deal with the subjugators quickly because you're always surrounded and they are the real threat. However, if you are not comfortable doing this, you can just activate your Bolt Charge barricade and deal with them from a distance. This is extremely useful to do, especially with Strand Subjugator, as they can very easily suspend you and kill you. If you don't feel comfortable using Synthoceps, I highly recommend sticking to Skull Fort for the extra healing and damage reduction when you need it. For extra survival, I recommend going with the Strand, Solar and Stasis resistances to help mitigate the damage you take from the subjugators. In order to avoid easy deaths in the door, I highly recommend using a shotgun and just shooting that 2-3 times and it'll easily open the door, or a fusion rifle if you prefer that instead. For damage, I done damage at the far right back, and that way the boss usually stays at the middle of the room and doesn't bother moving closer. However, if he does, always make sure to move back when he's doing the strand pull in. This is because he can very easily follow up with a strand attack to suspend you, and if he does this during the end of the damage phase, he will burn you alive. The damage phase isn't long for this boss. I highly recommend using either Queensbreaker or Sleeper Simulant because of the weekend this season, and outside of season it is still very good precision damage alongside with Bolt Charge dealing additional damage. You can also use a gun like Lost Signal with auto-load and holster to deal additional damage over time. The amount of phases will heavily depend based on the luck with the boss, because sometimes the boss hides behind pillars and sometimes he stands still, resulting in a comfortable 4 phase. However, I believe I've done this in 5 phases. He pulled me in and I had to T-crash out or else I'd die, so this boss does involve quite a bit of luck. The bonus of doing the damage at the back, when the fire activates, the fire won't reach you, so you can still deal damage when it's ending, allowing to squeeze out that extra damage. Overall, the speed of this encounter has slowed down greatly, comparing it to the previous encounter, but don't let that trip you up. This dungeon isn't as cracked compared to Vespers Host, which made it quite an enjoyable change of pace. Thank you for watching.